And so as we turn to Matthew 26, I don't know what Brother Clayton's going to be teaching on in the 11 o'clock service, but I'm assuming it may be a resurrection type message. So this is going to actually deal with, before that, with the trial of Christ leading up to the crucifixion. So I want to preface the lesson today by stating the trial of Jesus was unjust and illegal by virtually every standard of justice established by the Great Sanhedrin. Now, the Great Sanhedrin is the one who condemned Christ to death and delivered him up to Pilate. Of course, Pilate found no fault in him and still condemned him to be crucified. But the trial of Jesus was unjust and illegal by virtually every standard that the court had established for themselves to govern justice by. Caiaphas and the members of the Sanhedrin turned the highest ruling body in Jerusalem into a lynching court because they were determined to find Jesus worthy of death. Now, in Matthew 26, and verse number 3 and 4, it says, Then assembled together the chief priest and the scribes and the elders of the people under the palace of the high priest, who was called Caiaphas, and consulted that they might take Jesus by subtlety and kill him. But they said, not on the feast day, lest there be an uproar amongst the people. Now, you've got several events that take place from this point to actually when he is taken prisoner, taken into custody after Judas betrays him. But I want to review, I've got quite a few verses to read today, so I'm going to do some reviewing regarding the Sanhedrin court, and then we'll get into some scriptures. The rules of justice the Sanhedrin has set up for themselves. They needed two credible witnesses were needed to establish guilt. The person charged was entitled to a public trial. Death penalty cases required, notice this, a full day of fasting between the passing of sentence and the execution of the criminal. That didn't take place with Jesus. The council could only try cases where an outside party brought charges against the accused. In other words, no member of the Sanhedrin court could be the accuser. Criminal trials were never to be convened at night. Well, we know Jesus was tried at night, all night. And so we see they violated every rule that they had established for themselves, the highest court in the land at that time. Let's go to John chapter 18 and look at 12 through 14. John chapter 18 and verses 12 through 14. We'll be flipping back and forth through some of the Gospels this morning. And so John chapter 18, verse number 12, it says here, Then the band of the captain of the officers of the Jews took Jesus and bound him and led him away to Annas first, for he was father-in-law to Caiaphas, which was the high priest that same year. Now Caiaphas was he which gave counsel to the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. All right, so looking at these verses here, we understand, if you look at the four Gospels and all four accounts, that they leave Annas out. And Annas wasn't the acting high priest, he was retired. And so he was a former high priest in Jerusalem, and though he no longer held the office, he was very much in control behind the scenes, and he was one of the most powerful men in Jerusalem at that time. He served, the history is he served high priest for 20 years, from AD 7 to 14. And Caiaphas was son-in-law to Annas, and was more of a puppet for the retired Annas. So you'll notice in these verses, it says in verse 13, they led him away to Annas first. And Annas is holding no public office at this point, but they still led him to Annas's house to try to figure out what they were going to do. And then it says Caiaphas was he that gave counsel. Okay, we'll stop there. Now, notice we'll jump down to verse number 19 of this chapter. We're in John 18 and jump down to verse 19. The high priest then asked Jesus of his disciples and of his doctrine. All right, so as we notice, I know we're catching up to the story here, but it'll make more sense as we go along. The initial hearing, Jesus was first taken to the house of Annas. and it was evidently to trump up a charge against Jesus. They had him in custody. They finally had Jesus in custody. And so they were going to do whatever they could to get a death penalty conviction and kill Jesus. This was their desire, because if we look at the first verse we read in Matthew 26, they had gathered together and counseled together how they might take him by subtlety and kill him. So note that Annas was not officially a member of the Sanhedrin, so he could make legal accusation against Jesus. All right? So let's notice next in verse number 19, it says the high priest asked Jesus of his doctrine or of his disciples and his doctrine. So he's trying to engage Jesus in some conversation and get Jesus to, trap himself. And he's, in effect, he's being arraigned before he was even indicted on charges. So right now all he is in custody. Jesus was taken, in the Garden of Gethsemane. We back up the story, that Judas Iscariot came with the soldiers, and they had lanterns and torches because it was nighttime. And they walked up to Jesus. Of course, we know Peter cut the ear off of one of the soldiers, and Jesus healed that. And then he allows them to take him into custody. They bind him. First thing they do is they take him to Annas. And so this is nighttime, okay? So they're trying to arraign him or bring, and there's no charges even against him yet, okay? No witnesses even. So what Annas is trying to slyly do is to get Jesus to begin speaking, to testify against himself. And this was contrary to the rules of justice we read about in the beginning. So notice in chapter 18 now, verse 20 and 21, Jesus exposes the illegality of Annas' line of questioning. So in verse 20 it says, Jesus answered and said, I spake openly to the world. I ever taught in the synagogue and in the temple, whither the Jews always resort, and in secret have I said nothing. Why askest thou me? Ask them which heard me, which I have said unto them. Behold, they know what I said. All right, so Jesus here, he stands up for himself to a degree and says, ask someone else. In other words, he's telling Annas, you need to bring charges. Why are you asking me about my doctrine, about my disciples? Jesus knew the rules of the Sanhedrin court. He knew that Annas was no longer had technical authority and power, and yet he's the one questioning Jesus here in the beginning. And so he just tells Annas, bring charges. I have nothing to say. So Jesus had no legal obligation to testify against himself, especially since no charges had been filed, and he was being held illegally for questioning. Verse 22, and when he had thus spoken, one of the officers which stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, Answerest thou the high priest so? Jesus answered him, If I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil, but if well, why smitest thou me? Now again, Jesus exposes the error of Annas and those present at this initial questioning. Now, that's what this is. This is at Annas' house, not Caiaphas, who was the acting high priest at the time. And it's just kind of an initial, they were trying to gather steam. They had to figure this thing out. They had Jesus in custody. They were trying to figure this thing out. And so Jesus' response to the soldier was, again, bear witness. In other words, bring charges. All right, so he said, if I've spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. Bring witnesses. It was his accuser's responsibility to give a detailed account and prove that he was guilty of any wrongdoing. Now, they had a problem because Jesus was perfect. And so it's a little bit difficult unless you fabricate lies, and that's what they were intent on doing, whatever it took. And unless you fabricate lies, you can't entrap a perfect man in his own language. He's perfect. He's not going to say anything that's going to bring an indictment against himself. Of course, he's God in the flesh. Now, it was his accuser's responsibility to give this detailed account. And let's notice verse number 28 in the same chapter. It says, Then led they Jesus from Caiaphas unto the hall of judgment, and it was early, and they themselves went not into the judgment hall, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. Now, this is the irony with this whole passage, is that these just judges who were violating all of these rules of their own laws and rules. Now we're going to strictly abide by the Passover rules because they wouldn't go into the judgment hall unless they defile themselves. But yet they'll try an innocent man illegally. I mean, we see the irony here. So now we're going to pick up in Matthew chapter 26 once again, and let's read verse 59 and 60. The Sanhedrin now is going to solicit false testimony. So it's like they send their leaders out or the soldiers out into the community. Now it's nighttime, remember? I mean, they got a problem on their hands. Most people are asleep, and now they're trying to find. It's like, did you hear anything? What about you? Did you hear anything at all we can bring against Jesus as an indictment? Anything at all? Right? That's what they're up against. So in chapter 26 of Matthew, verse 59, it says, "Now the chief priests and elders and all the council," notice this, chief priests, elders, all the council sought, notice the words here, sought false witness against Jesus to put him to death. But they found none. Yea, though many false witnesses came, yet found they none. At last came two false witnesses. And so we'll stop there for a second. The Sanhedrin court was responsible for hearing the case and bringing impartial judgment. That was all they were supposed to do. They weren't supposed to go out in the highways and byways. Turn to Deuteronomy 19, and let's look at how this is supposed to be set up. But they were going out in the highways and byways trying to find an accuser. Can you imagine if you were, let's say you were stopped by a local policeman and you were arrested and you were hauled into jail, and then now all of a sudden, the chief of police and the judge and the lawyers in the community are going out and they're saying, "Do you need this guy do anything wrong? You know anything about this guy at all? We can pin something on him, something to accuse him of. We need to put this man in prison or put him to death." That's in effect what they were doing with Jesus Christ. So we notice now in Deuteronomy 19, in verse 16, it says, "If a false witness rise up against any man to testify against him that which is wrong, then both the men between whom the controversy is shall stand before the Lord, before the priest," and that's what they were doing, "and the judges, which shall be in those days, and the judges shall make diligent inquisition, and behold, if the witness be a false witness, and hath testified falsely against his brother, then shall ye do unto him as he had thought to have done unto his brother. So shalt thou put the evil away from among you." Now, I was just thinking about this as we read this passage. These two false witnesses we're going to read about that come against Christ and provide uncredible testimony because they're going to talk about Jesus raising himself after 3 days. We're talking about the temple, obviously. We'll get to that in a second. But think about, I've always thought, of course, Judas Iscariot bore such a brunt of the guilt, but how much guilt did these two men bear? I mean, they're the ones who this entire indictment was hanging on their false testimony, and they were accusing Jesus falsely. And I'm thinking to myself as I'm reading this, these men were, we don't talk about them much, but they were very, very guilty of a grievous crime here. Now let's go back to our text, and let me see where I'm at in my notes. I think we're in Matthew 26 still. Now we're going to go to Mark, actually, chapter 14. So we're jumping around just a little bit. Mark 14 and verse 55 and 56. We have to actually tie the four Gospels together to get the full picture, but it's easily done if we get the right scripture. So Mark 14, verse 55, it says, "And the chief priest and all the council sought," there it is again, "sought for witness against Jesus to put him to death, and found none." Now, in the Greek, the word sought means to seek or to plot. So they were plotting against Christ for witnesses. And then verse 56, "For many bear false witness against him, but their witness agreed not together." Now, what do we read in Deuteronomy? A witness would have to come and bring testimony. And, of course, we also know that the Bible says in the Old Testament, "In the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, let everything be established." So now we go to verse 57 of the same chapter, and it says, "And there arose certain and bare false witnesses against him, saying, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands. But neither so did their witness agree together. All right, so here's where things begin to pick up steam for the Sanhedrin. And Annas the high priest was desperate for any kind of measurable, credible testimony. But verse 59 in the scriptures reveal they found two false witnesses that had similar stories, but they didn't completely agree. So, you know, a lawyer, if Jesus had a good lawyer standing there by him, he would have objected and said, throw this out. This does, you know, their witness doesn't agree with one another, so we have to discount both of them. Well, obviously that didn't happen for Christ. Now, based on the inconsistencies of these testimonies, they should have been disallowed. We're going to go now to John chapter 2. And I want to read the passage where Jesus makes this statement about rebuilding the temple. So in John chapter 2, verse number 13, John chapter 2 and verse number 13, it says here, and the Jews' Passover was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem and found in the temple those that sold oxen and sheep and doves, and the changers of money sitting. And when he had made a scourge of small cords, he drove them all out of the temple, and the sheep and the oxen, and poured out the changers' money, and overthrew the tables. And said unto them that sold doves, take these things hence, make not my Father's house a house of merchandise. And his disciples remembered that it was written, the zeal of thine house hath eaten me up. Then answered the Jews and said unto him, now when it refers to the Jews, usually in the New Testament, it's referring to the leaders, the leadership. It says, then answered the Jews and said unto him, what sign showest thou unto us, seeing that thou doest these things? Jesus answered and said unto them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Then said the Jews, 46 years was this temple in building, and wilt thou rear it up in 3 days? But he spake of the temple of his body. All right, so these two witnesses had obviously been present when these words were spoken by Christ. I'm going to assume maybe they were one of the businessmen that was thrown out, and so maybe they had, you know, an axe to grind with Jesus because he had destroyed their cash cow, so to speak. So we notice here. That they may have a score to settle, and then the charge is brought of blasphemy because he claimed he could rebuild the temple by miraculous means. So now let's go to also Mark chapter 14 once again, and let's look at verse 56 through 61. Mark chapter 14, and we'll begin in verse number 56. It says, for many bear false witness against him, but their witness agreed not together. And there arose certain and bare false witness against him, saying, we have heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands. But neither so did their witness agree together. And the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, saying, answerest thou nothing? What is it which these witness against thee? But he held his peace and answered nothing. Again, the high priest asked him and said unto him, art thou the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? Now we'll stop there because I want to notice that in this passage here that Jesus declined to testify against himself regarding the false accusations. Now we know in Isaiah 53 it says, it prophesied that he would be as a lamb or a sheep brought before the shearers, and he was as dumb. And in other words, he wouldn't open his mouth. He's not going to testify against himself in the sense that he's going to, with these false accusers, he's not going to stand there and say this or that about his own innocence. He didn't do that. So, but we do notice next that the charge comes forth. The charge is blasphemy. Now we notice in I'm going to go back. We'll probably come back here to Mark in just a minute. But let's go back to John 4 in verse 25 and 26. Jesus is charged with blasphemy, and Caiaphas knew that Jesus had claimed to be the Son of God, and that's why he pins him down with it. But in John chapter 4, verse 25, and 26. John 4:25. It says here, the woman said unto him, I know that Messiah cometh, which is called Christ. When he is come, he will tell us all things. This is the woman at the well. And Jesus saith unto her, I that speak unto thee am he. All right, so Jesus reveals his deity to the woman at the well. John 5, now in verse 16 through 18. And therefore did the Jews persecute Jesus and sought to slay him, because he had done these things on the Sabbath day. But Jesus answered them, My Father worketh hitherto, and I work. Therefore the Jews sought the more to kill him, because he not only had broken the Sabbath, but said also that God was his Father, making himself equal with God. Now the narrative is beginning to make sense, you see. So we see he revealed himself to the woman at the well, and then they had overheard some things where they had realized that he's claiming to be the Son of God. Now chapter 9 of John 9, and let's look at verse number 14. John 9 and verse number 14, it says, And on the Sabbath day when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes, then again the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. And he said unto them, He put clay upon mine eyes, and I washed, and do see. Therefore said some of the Pharisees, This man is not of God, because he keepeth not the Sabbath day. Others said, How can a man that is a sinner do such miracles? And there was a division among them. They said unto the blind man again, What sayest thou of him, that he hath opened thine eyes? And he said, He's a prophet. But the Jews did not believe concerning him. Again, the Jews are referring to the leadership here. And that he had been blind and received his sight, until they called the parents of him that had received his sight. And they asked them, saying, Is this your son, who you say was born blind? How then doth he now see? His parents answered them and said, We know that this is our son, and that he was born blind. But by what means he now seeth, we know not. Or who hath opened his eyes, we know not. He is of age, ask him, he shall speak for himself. These words spake his parents, because they feared the Jews. For the Jews had agreed already that if any man did confess that he was the Christ, he should be put out of the synagogue. So this was circling around. People understood, if you follow this man, you're going to lose your privileges, spiritual privileges. Therefore said his parents, He is of age, ask him. Then again called they the man that was blind, and said unto him, Give God the praise. We know that this man is a sinner. So they bring the blind man who's now able to see. They bring him back in. They say, Give God the Father the praise. Don't give this man any praise, because he's just a sinner. Okay? They're trying to entrap this man in his own words. And he answered, verse 25, and said, Whether he be a sinner or no, I know not. One thing I know, that whereas I was blind, now I see. Then said they to him again, What did he to thee? How did he open thine eyes? And he answered them and said, I have told you already, and ye did not hear. Wherefore would ye hear it again? Will you also be his disciples? Now this got him. He says, Will you also be his disciples? Then they reviled him and said, Thou art his disciple, but we are Moses' disciple. We know that God spake unto Moses. As for this fellow, we know not from whence he is. The man answered and said unto them, Why herein is a marvelous thing, that ye know not from whence he is, and yet he hath opened mine eyes. This man is now eloquent. Now we know that God heareth not sinners, but if any man be a worshiper of God, and doeth his will, him he heareth. Since the world began, was it not heard that any man opened the eyes of one that was born blind? This man's getting really eloquent. This is a blind man speaking, right? If this man were not of God, he could do nothing. They answered and said unto him, Thou wast altogether born in sins, and dost thou teach us? And they cast him out they cast him out. Verse 35. Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and when he had found him, he said unto him, Dost thou believe on the Son of God? Now notice the questioning. Jesus is getting pretty specific here. Dost thou believe on the Son of God? He answered and said, Who is he, Lord, that I might believe on him? And Jesus said unto him, Thou hast both seen him, and it is he that talketh with thee. And he said, Lord, I believe. And he worshiped him. All right, so there's three examples of Jesus revealing his deity that we've read about, and him claiming to be the Son of God. Now, claiming to be God would have been sufficient grounds for charging an ordinary man with blasphemy. And blasphemy was a capital crime under the law of Moses. It says in verse Leviticus 24, you don't have to turn there, but it says, He that blasphemeth the name of the Lord shall be surely put to death. and all the congregation shall surely stone him. So see, if they had followed the law of Moses, they would have stoned Jesus Christ instead of crucifying him. But we know that under Roman law, the way they did capital punishment was through crucifixion. And of course, Jesus had already prophesied that if he be lifted up, all men could look unto him and be saved. It just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness. So stoning wasn't prophesied for Christ. But that's what he should have been if he was guilty of this. He should have been stoned to death. So again, we have a disagreement in the way the Sanhedrin performed their justice. Caiaphas knew that he still needed credible testimony to prove that Jesus had claimed to be equal with God. All right, so these two false witnesses that had come and claimed that Jesus had performed blasphemy or spoken blasphemy, Caiaphas knew that really wasn't enough. It wasn't credible enough. So Caiaphas demands of Jesus, go back to Mark chapter 14, he demands of Jesus whether or not he is the Christ. Now, when you claim to be the Christ, the anointed one, even these unbelievers, they were well versed in the Old Testament. They knew that the Messiah was going to be an anointed man of God. And so we notice now in Mark chapter 14, verse 61, I'm in Matthew, give me just a second here. Mark 14, and verse number 61, we'll read down a few more verses. It says, "But he held his peace and answered nothing. Again the high priest asked him and said unto him, Art thou the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" Now, Jesus Christ was directly asked a question whether or not he was the Son of God. All right, so the prophecy in Isaiah 53 did not apply here because this is not a false accusation. He wasn't being falsely accused of something from these two uncredible witnesses. He was asked by Caiaphas, "Are you the Son of God?" Now notice what Jesus says in verse 62. He says, "And Jesus said, I am, and ye shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest rent his clothes and said, "What need we of any further witnesses? Ye have heard the blasphemy. What think ye?" He puts it on the Sanhedrin. And they all condemned him to death, to be guilty of death. And some began to spit on him, cover his face, to buffet him and say, "Prophesy," and so on and so forth. All right, so now we have the indictment. We've got a guilty guilty verdict that Jesus is guilty of blasphemy. Well, what was the blasphemy? That Jesus said, "I am the Son of God." So in effect, Jesus is being put to death for being God. Think about it now. He's being literally put to death on the cross because he said he was God, but he is God, right? Now, he proved his deity by all the miracles that he worked. And it's like the eloquent blind man who now can see. He told the Jews, the leader of the Jews, he really put it right back on them and said, "How can this man not be of God with all the miracles he's doing?" You know, even if you just logically think about it. I mean, Jesus for 3 years had traversed, I think, three different full circuits of the entire nation of Israel and had performed miracle after miracle after miracle. I mean, there's no denying the power of this man, right? In fact, remember when John the Baptist, he sent some of his disciples, he was in prison, and he sent them to Christ, and he said, you know, are you really the one? And Jesus told him, he said, he didn't answer them at first. And they were standing there witnessing some of the crowd, and Jesus performed some miracles in the sight of these followers of John the Baptist. And then he turns to the John the Baptist's disciples and he said, "If you don't believe me for the work's sake, because I'm proving who I am by my power." You see, so God give Jesus all the power that he needed on earth and in heaven. Now let's notice, and we're almost to a close here. Let's notice now that Caiaphas demands of Jesus whether he's the Christ. This is the precise answer that he's looking for. Notice again in verse number 63 of Mark 14. Then the high priest rent his clothes and said, "What need we of any further witnesses?" Now I want you to notice the hypocrisy of these learned, scholarly, just men who were the leaders of the land. It reminds me of Matthew 23, where Jesus really indicted them and said, you're just whited sepulchres. You're clean on the outside, but on the inside, you're full of dead men's bones. That's what these men were. So we got one of these type of men who's rending his clothes. That'd be like me taking my shirt and just ripping it in half right now because I'm so distraught that this man has performed blasphemy right in front of all of us. All right, so we notice in, lastly, Jesus was sentenced to death for being God. And we ask the question, isn't that just like lost humanity? Think about it now. Kill God and answer to no one for your sins. Let's just kill God. So in effect, that's what the devil has tried to blind the eyes of the world. Where'd evolution come from? Right? There is no God. Everything evolved, right? From a primordial soup, and then we have this amoeba, and then then a tadpole and a frog, and then we got into monkeys, and now we're all men and women, right? And so there's no God, so we have to answer to nobody. I mean, that's exactly what's taking place here. The Sanhedrin court is trying to deny the deity of Jesus Christ, and Jesus would not stand there and say, well, of course I'm not the Christ. He would be lying, and then he would be an imposter. But of course Jesus was pure. So kill God, answer to no one for your sins. But unfortunately it doesn't work that way. The last passage I want to look at is in John chapter 3, and I know you're familiar with this, but I want to end the lesson this morning with the gospel message in the sense that the reason Jesus went through all this, the reason Jesus went to the cross, and the reason Jesus shed his blood, because of his love. Now, the Bible says that after the resurrection, a great number of priests actually believed. I don't know if some of the Sanhedrin court were some of those or not. Maybe so. Maybe some of those who actually sentenced Christ to death got saved later on. We know Nicodemus did, but notice in John chapter 3, in verse number 14, it says, and as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have eternal life. For God so loved the world that God gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. For God sent not his Son into the world to condemn or to rule the world, but that the world through him might be saved. He that believeth on him is not condemned, but he that believeth on him not, or believeth not, is condemned already, because he hath not believed in the name of the only begotten Son of God. And this is the condemnation, that light is come into the world. That's Jesus. And men love darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil. For everyone that doeth evil hateth the light. So you hate Christ. If you're not saved this morning, you would never admit, if you're sitting in this church building, if you're not saved, you would never admit that you hate Christ. But if your deeds are evil and you're lost, in effect, that's what you've done. Your life is making a perpetual statement that I hate Christ. Because Christ revealeth the sin that you've got to repent of in order to be saved. You see? And so we notice here in verse 20, for everyone that doeth evil hateth the light. Hateth the light. Who's the light? Jesus. Neither cometh to the light, lest his deeds should be reproved. But he that doeth truth cometh to the light, that his deeds may be made manifest, that they are wrought in